The dust clouds appeared first on the horizon, rolling across the prairie like promises written in dirt and wind. It was mid-October 1887, and Millbrook had seen nothing but routine for months: cattle drives, disputes over water rights, and the endless monotony of survival in the American frontier. Setting the scene, the town stretched along a single main street, flanked by weathered wooden buildings that bore the scars of harsh winters and blazing summers. The bank stood at the corner of Main and Cedar, its brick facade a testament to permanence in a world built on uncertainty. Inside, Thomas Whitmore sat behind his mahogany desk, reviewing loan applications with the precision of a man who understood that in the West, money meant survival. At 34, Thomas had earned a reputation as the most uncompromising banker in 3 counties. His charcoal suits never wrinkled, his pocket watch never ran slow, and his decisions never wavered. The townspeople respected him, feared him, but none claimed to know him. "Mr. Whitmore," called Martha Henderson, the bank secretary, peering through his office door. "There's quite a commotion outside. Looks like a traveling show." Thomas glanced up from his papers, his steel-grey eyes showing the faintest flicker of annoyance. "I trust they have permits for whatever disturbance they're planning." But as the sounds grew louder, wheels creaking, horses snorting, voices calling in languages he didn't recognize, something drew him to the window. The circus caravan was unlike anything Millbrook had ever seen. Painted wagons in brilliant reds and golds, exotic animals in wooden cages, and performers in costumes that seemed to capture sunlight itself. Enter the trapeze artist. Among the circus folk, Isabella Rossi stood out not just for her beauty, but for the way she moved as if gravity were merely a suggestion. At 28, she had spent her life defying the laws that bound ordinary people to the earth. Her dark hair caught the afternoon light as she directed the setup of the trapeze rigging, her movements fluid and confident. "Careful with those ropes, Jimmy," she called to a young worker, her voice carrying a melodic accent that spoke of distant places and different dreams. "My life depends on every knot." The townspeople gathered, drawn by curiosity and the promise of entertainment in their routine lives. Children pressed against their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed at the spectacle. Men removed their hats, not out of politeness, but in awe. The first glimpse. From his office window, Thomas watched Isabella test the tension of the trapeze cables. She moved with a dancer's grace, checking each connection with the expertise of someone who understood that perfection meant survival. For a moment, just a moment, her gaze swept across the street and seemed to pause at his window. Their eyes met across the distance, and Thomas felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening in a room he'd kept locked for years. Isabella smiled, not the practiced smile of a performer, but something genuine and curious before turning back to her work. "Sir?" Martha's voice seemed to come from far away. "The Morrison account. You wanted to review it before closing." Thomas blinked, realizing he'd been staring. "Yes, of course, send them in." But as he returned to his desk, the numbers on the page seemed less important than the image burned into his memory. A woman who lived in the sky, unafraid of falling, setting up the conflict. That evening, the circus held its first performance in the makeshift arena they'd constructed at the edge of town. The entire population of Millbrook seemed to have gathered, clutching their children and their coins with equal fervor. Thomas told himself he was attending purely as a matter of civic duty to ensure the event proceeded without incident. He chose a seat in the back, his black suit making him nearly invisible in the shadows. The show began with jugglers and acrobats, each act building toward the moment when Isabella appeared. The crowd fell silent as she climbed the ladder to the platform 30 feet above the ground with no net below. "Ladies and gentlemen," the ringmaster's voice boomed, "presenting the Flying Rose of Milano, Miss Isabella Rossi." What followed was poetry written in motion. Isabella soared through the air with a grace that defied belief, catching the bar at the perfect moment, spinning through space as if she were dancing with the wind itself. The audience gasped collectively with each death-defying leap, but Thomas found himself watching her face instead of her tricks. In the air, Isabella was completely alive, completely free. Her smile was radiant, unguarded in a way that Thomas had never seen in anyone. She was everything he was not, spontaneous, fearless, unburdened by the weight of others' expectations. The chapter's end. As the performance concluded and Isabella took her bow, her eyes swept the crowd and found Thomas in the shadows. This time, neither looked away. The applause faded to background noise as they held each other's gaze across the impossible distance between his ordered world and her boundless sky. The chapter ends with Thomas walking home alone through the empty streets, his footsteps echoing against the wooden sidewalks. Above him, stars scattered across the prairie sky like possibilities he'd never dared to consider. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Thomas made his usual walk to the bank. But today, something was different. The circus had transformed the empty lot behind Murphy's General Store into a small village of colorful tents and wagons. The smell of coffee mixed with hay and something exotic, cinnamon perhaps or cardamom. The unexpected encounter. Thomas was reviewing his pocket watch when he heard a voice behind him. "Excuse me, sir, are you the banker?" He turned to find Isabella standing barely 3 feet away, dressed in a simple blue dress that somehow seemed more elegant than any gown he'd seen at the county social gatherings. Up close, her eyes were the color of dark chocolate, warm and inviting. "Thomas Whitmore," he said, extending his hand with the formal courtesy that had become second nature. "Isabella Rossi." Her handshake was firm, calloused from years of gripping trapeze bars. "I need to exchange some foreign currency. European coins. We've been traveling." Inside the bank. As they walked into the bank, Thomas was acutely aware of how the other patrons stared. Martha Henderson's eyebrows nearly disappeared into her hairline. Old Pete Miller, who came in every Tuesday to check his savings balance, stopped mid-sentence and watched Isabella with the fascination reserved for mythical creatures. "Right this way, Miss Rossi," Thomas said, gesturing toward his office. Inside, Isabella looked around with genuine curiosity at the certificates on the walls, the leather-bound ledgers, the solid oak furniture that spoke of permanence and tradition. "You've built quite an empire here," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Hardly an empire, just stability, security for the town's financial future." Isabella smiled, pulling a small pouch from her reticule. "In my world, security is knowing how to fall safely. Everything else is just borrowed time." As Thomas examined her currency, coins from Italy, France, Spain, she told him stories. About performing in Paris under gaslight, about a storm in Colorado that nearly destroyed their entire show, about the family she'd lost and found again in the circus community. "You never married?" Thomas found himself asking, then immediately reddened at his forwardness. "Married to the heir," she replied with a laugh that seemed to fill the room with light. "It's a jealous husband, demands all my attention. What about you, Mr. Whitmore? Surely the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties has his choice of wives." Thomas's vulnerability. Thomas's hands stilled on the coins. I've never found anyone who understood that sometimes a man needs silence more than conversation, solitude more than society. And you think that makes you unmarriageable? It makes me practical. Marriage requires compromise, and I'm not flexible in my ways. Isabella leaned forward, her expression growing serious. "You know, Mr. Whitmore, the trapeze is all about flexibility. Rigid things break when they're tested. But something that bends, that adapts, that survives. The walking tour." Their business concluded, Isabella asked if Thomas might show her around town. "I like to understand the places we perform, the people who welcome us." Against his better judgment, or perhaps because of it, Thomas found himself walking with her down Main Street. She asked questions about everything, the history of the buildings, the families who lived there, the challenges the community faced. At Sarah Mitchell's bakery, Isabella charmed the proprietress into sharing the recipe for her famous apple turnovers. At the blacksmith shop, she fascinated Big Jim O'Brien with stories of the mechanical rigging systems used in European circuses. "You're not what I expected," Thomas admitted as they paused outside the schoolhouse. "What did you expect?" "Someone temporary, superficial. People who live on the road, I assumed they'd be—" He struggled for words. "Rootless, empty?" Isabella's tone wasn't offended, just curious. "Perhaps." Isabella was quiet for a moment, watching children play in the schoolyard. "I've lived in more places than I can count, Mr. Whitmore, but I've learned that roots aren't about where you stay, they're about what you carry with you. The love, the memories, the connections you make. The challenge." As they walked back toward the bank, they passed Reverend Johnston and his wife Millicent. The Reverend tipped his hat politely, but Mrs. Johnston's expression was tight with disapproval. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore," she said coldly, her eyes never leaving Isabella. "I trust you're conducting business?" After they passed, Isabella laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I see small towns are the same everywhere. The circus folk are fine for entertainment, but not for society. Mrs. Johnston is traditional in her views. And you? Are you traditional in your views, Mr. Whitmore?" Thomas stopped walking. The question hung between them like a challenge, and for the first time in years, he found himself genuinely uncertain of his answer. The performance connection. That evening, Thomas found himself at the circus again, drawn by something he couldn't name. This time, he watched not just Isabella's performance, but the joy on the faces around him. Little Annie Peterson clapped so hard her hands must have hurt. Doc Williams forgot his usual stern demeanor and laughed like a child. When Isabella flew through her routine, Thomas noticed details he'd missed before. The precise timing of her movements, the strength required for her seemingly effortless grace, the complete trust she placed in her equipment and her abilities. After the show, as the crowd dispersed, Isabella appeared beside him. "You came back," she said, slightly breathless from her performance. "I did." "Why?" Thomas looked at her. Really looked. Her hair was still perfect despite her acrobatics, but there was a small smudge of rosin on her cheek, and her eyes held the particular exhaustion of someone who had given everything to their art. "I wanted to understand how you do it, how you trust so completely in something so uncertain." Isabella smiled, but it was gentler than her usual radiant expression. "The same way you trust that the ground will be there when you walk, Mr. Whitmore. Faith isn't about certainty, it's about moving forward anyway." Chapter ending. As Thomas walked Isabella back to the circus grounds, their conversation grew quieter, more personal. She told him about her childhood in Italy, about losing her parents to illness, and finding a new family with the circus. He found himself sharing memories of his father's death, of taking over the bank at 25, of the loneliness that success had brought. At the entrance to the circus grounds, they paused. The night air was crisp with the promise of winter, and overhead the stars seemed closer than usual. "Thank you," Isabella said simply, "for today, for showing me your town." "Thank you," Thomas replied, "for showing me that it's more interesting than I realized." They stood there for a moment, two people from completely different worlds, discovering that perhaps the distance between them wasn't as vast as they'd imagined. The third day brought grey skies and the kind of wind that cuts through clothing and settles in bones. Thomas arrived at the bank to find Martha Henderson waiting with a disapproving frown and a steaming cup of coffee. "The whole town's talking," she announced without preamble. "About what?" "About you and that circus woman, walking around bold as brass, chatting like old friends." Thomas hung his coat carefully on its hook, a ritual that gave him time to compose his response. "Miss Rossi required currency exchange and information about local businesses. I provided professional service." Martha's snort suggested she found this explanation less than convincing. Professional service doesn't usually include guided tours and intimate conversations in front of Mitchell's bakery. The town council meeting. By noon, 3 members of the town council had found reasons to visit the bank. Mayor Harrison came first, ostensibly to discuss the municipal account, but his real purpose became clear when he lingered after their business was concluded. "Thomas, you know I've always respected your judgment," he began, settling his considerable bulk into the client chair. "But folks are starting to talk about you and that circus performer. I'm aware of the gossip. It's not just gossip when it affects the town's confidence in its financial institutions. People trust you because you're steady, reliable, above reproach." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Are you suggesting my personal conduct affects my professional competence?" "I'm suggesting that appearances matter, especially for someone in your position." The pressure mounts. Councilman Briggs arrived an hour later, followed by Mrs. Whitman from the Ladies' Auxiliary. Each carried the same message wrapped in different words. Thomas's reputation was the foundation of the town's trust, and that trust was now in question. "She's not our kind, Thomas," Mrs. Whitman said, with the authority of someone who had appointed herself guardian of social propriety. "These circus people, they live by different rules, no morals, no stability. Today they're here, tomorrow they're gone, leaving broken hearts and ruined reputations behind." "You don't know Miss Rossi," Thomas found himself saying, "and neither do you, dear boy. That's exactly the problem." Isabella's struggles. Meanwhile, Isabella faced her own challenges. The circus family that had welcomed her so warmly was now watching her with concern. Maestro Giuseppe, the aging Italian who served as the circus's unofficial patriarch, found her practicing alone on the low rigging. "Little bird," he said in accented English, "you fly differently these days. Your heart is not in the air, it is on the ground." Isabella dismounted from the practice bar, wiping her hands on her skirts. "I'm fine, Maestro." "Fine is what we say when everything is not fine." He studied her with the sharp eyes of someone who had seen life in all its complexity. "This banker, he is a good man?" "Yes, but he's not our kind of man." "Ah, and what kind is that?" Isabella struggled to find words. "He's rooted, permanent. Everything I'm not, and you think roots mean prison." The internal conflict. That afternoon, Thomas found himself unable to concentrate on his work. The numbers in his ledgers seemed to mock him with their absolute certainty. For 34 years, he had lived by rules that made sense. Work hard, save money, maintain respectability, avoid unnecessary risks. But when he thought about Isabella, her laughter, her stories, the way she made the ordinary world seem full of unexpected possibilities, those rules felt less like wisdom and more like walls. Dr. Williams's unexpected visit interrupted his brooding. The town physician was one of the few people Thomas considered a friend, and his expression was uncharacteristically serious. Tom," he said, using the nickname from their school days, "I need to speak with you frankly. About my supposed romance with Miss Rossi. About your happiness." Dr. Williams settled into his chair with the weariness of a man who had seen too much human suffering. "I've watched you for years, building walls around yourself in the name of responsibility. When did you last smile, really smile?" The question caught Thomas off guard. "I smile." "You grimace politely, it's not the same thing." Dr. Williams leaned forward. "I've seen how you look when you watch her perform, like you're seeing color for the first time after years of looking at the world in black and white." Isabella's realization. That evening, Isabella walked alone through the town, drawn by the lights in windows that spoke of families gathered for dinner, of lives lived in comfortable predictability. She found herself standing across from Thomas's house, a neat, modest home with well-tended flower beds and shutters that hung perfectly straight. Through the window, she could see him reading by lamplight, his profile serious and concentrated. For a moment, she imagined what it would be like to share such quiet evenings, to have someone waiting when she came home from performances, to build something lasting instead of always moving toward the next town, the next show. The fantasy was so vivid it left her breathless and terrifying. The confrontation. As if sensing her presence, Thomas looked up from his book. Their eyes met through the window glass, and neither moved for a long moment. Then he rose and came to the door. "Isabella, what are you doing here?" I was walking, thinking. "Come in, it's getting cold." Inside his home, Isabella was struck by how perfectly it reflected him. Everything in its place, books arranged by subject, not a speck of dust on the mantelpiece. But there was also loneliness in the perfect order, an emptiness that all the fine furniture couldn't fill. "I've been thinking too," Thomas said, offering her tea from a service that looked like it had rarely been used. "About what you said yesterday, about roots. And I think I've confused roots with chains, built myself a prison and called it security." Isabella set down her teacup with trembling hands. "Thomas, the town, they're not going to accept this. Us, whatever this is. I know. You could lose everything, your reputation, your position, their respect. I know that too." Thomas moved closer, his grey eyes holding hers. "But I'm beginning to think that losing their approval might be worth gaining something else. What if I break your heart? What if the circus moves on, and I go with it? What if I'm not the person you think I am?" Thomas reached out, his fingers barely touching her cheek. "What if you don't?" The chapter's climax. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and fear. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, but inside, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, and the choice they were both afraid to make. Isabella rose abruptly, her practical nature reasserting itself. "I should go. People will talk if they see me here. They're already talking. Then we shouldn't give them more ammunition." But as she moved toward the door, Thomas caught her hand. "Isabella, what are you afraid of?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Isabella looked at their joined hands, his pale and soft from indoor work, hers darker and marked by calluses from the trapeze bars. "I'm afraid," she whispered, "that if I let myself love you, I'll forget how to fly." "And I'm afraid," Thomas replied, "that if I don't let myself love you, I'll never learn what it means to truly live." Chapter ending. Isabella pulled her hand free gently and walked to the door. As she stepped into the night, she turned back one last time. "The circus leaves in 3 days, Thomas. Think carefully about what you really want." As Thomas watched her disappear into the darkness, he realized that for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he wanted. The question was whether he was brave enough to reach for it. The final performance night arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the weather itself had conspired to make the evening memorable. The entire town had turned out, not just for the entertainment, but for the spectacle of witnessing the end of what had become Millbrook's most talked-about romance. The decision. Thomas spent the morning in his office, staring at the paperwork that suddenly seemed meaningless. Martha Henderson worked quietly at her desk, the silence heavy with unspoken disapproval. Finally, she cleared her throat. "The circus leaves tomorrow," she said, without looking up from her typing. "I'm aware. Things can go back to normal then." Thomas looked up from his ledger. "What if I don't want things to be normal, Martha?" Her typing stopped. "Mr. Whitmore, you're not seriously considering—" "I'm considering that maybe normal isn't the same as right." The town's anticipation. By evening, the atmosphere on Main Street was electric with anticipation. Mrs. Whitman held court near the general store, predicting dire consequences if Thomas continued his unnatural fascination. Reverend Johnston spoke in hushed tones about the sanctity of community standards, but Dr. Williams stood apart from the gossip, watching Thomas with the knowing smile of someone who had seen a man finally wake up to his own life. "You going to the show tonight, Tom?" the doctor asked as Thomas passed. "I haven't decided. Might want to decide quickly. Some choices don't wait for us to feel ready." Isabella's preparation. In her trailer, Isabella prepared for what she knew would be her most difficult performance. Maestro Giuseppe watched her with fatherly concern as she applied her stage makeup with mechanical precision. "You perform tonight with a heavy heart, little bird. The heart has nothing to do with it. It's just another show. And tomorrow?" Isabella's hands stilled on her rouge. "Tomorrow we move on, like we always do. And if you don't want to move on, then I remember that wanting and doing are different things. I remember that people like us don't get fairy tale endings." The performance begins. The crowd was larger than any previous night, drawn by the promise of finality and the hope of witnessing drama. Thomas arrived as the show began, choosing his usual spot in the shadows. But tonight, he wasn't hiding, he was gathering courage. The early acts passed in a blur of color and noise. Jimmy the juggler dropped more pins than usual, nervous under the weight of the townspeople's expectations. The dancing horses performed flawlessly, but everyone was waiting for the main attraction, Isabella's final flight. When Isabella climbed the ladder to her platform, the entire crowd fell silent. Tonight she wore pure white, a costume that caught the torchlight and made her seem almost ethereal against the dark sky. "Ladies and gentlemen," the ringmaster announced, "for the final time in Millbrook, the Flying Rose of Milano." Isabella began her routine, but something was different. Her movements, usually filled with joy and abandon, carried a melancholy weight. She flew through the air with technical perfection, but her heart seemed anchored to the ground. Thomas watched from the shadows, recognizing the sorrow in her performance. This was goodbye, he realized. She was saying farewell not just to the town, but to the possibilities they had shared. The moment of truth. As Isabella completed her final sequence and took her bows, Thomas made his decision. While the crowd applauded and began to disperse, he walked forward, out of the shadows and into the light. The townspeople noticed immediately. Mrs. Whitman gasped audibly. Mayor Harrison stopped mid-conversation. Even the children sensed that something momentous was happening. Thomas walked steadily toward the performance area, his polished shoes crunching on sawdust and straw. Isabella, still catching her breath from her routine, saw him coming and froze. "Thomas, what are you doing?" He didn't answer with words. Instead, he climbed the steps to the small stage where she stood, his formal black suit stark against the circus backdrop. The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. The speech. Thomas turned to face the assembled townspeople, his neighbors, his clients, the community that had shaped his entire life. His voice carried clearly in the stillness. "For 34 years, he began, "I've lived by your expectations. I've been the man you needed me to be, stable, predictable, safe. I've never caused scandal or challenged convention. I've been the perfect banker, the perfect citizen." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Martha Henderson looked mortified. Mrs. Whitman fanned herself vigorously. "But I've never been a perfect man," Thomas continued, his eyes finding Isabella's. "I've never known joy for its own sake. Never taken a risk that couldn't be calculated. Never loved someone who made me want to be more than I thought possible." Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." He moved closer, his voice dropping so that only she could hear clearly. "I've spent my life afraid of falling, Isabella. But you've taught me that sometimes the only way to really live is to let go." The kiss. In front of the entire town of Millbrook, beneath a canopy of stars and torchlight, Thomas Whitmore cupped Isabella Rossi's face in his hands and kissed her with all the passion he had kept locked away for a lifetime. The effect was electric. The crowd didn't just gasp, they seemed to collectively hold their breath. Old Pete Miller's whiskey glass stopped halfway to his lips. Little Annie Peterson tugged on her mother's skirt, asking why everyone had turned into statues. Even the horses stood perfectly still, as if nature herself had paused to witness the moment. The kiss lasted only seconds, but it contained decades of repressed longing, years of careful propriety cast aside in a single reckless gesture of authentic feeling. The aftermath. When Thomas and Isabella finally broke apart, the silence was deafening. Then, unexpectedly, Dr. Williams began to clap. The sound was sharp in the stillness, but gradually others joined in. Sarah Mitchell from the bakery, Big Jim O'Brien from the smithy, some of the younger folks who had been charmed by Isabella's grace, but not everyone. Mrs. Whitman looked scandalized. Reverend Johnston shook his head sadly. Mayor Harrison appeared calculating, already considering the political implications. Isabella's response. Isabella looked stunned, her hand pressed to her lips, as if she could still feel the kiss. Thomas, the town, your reputation. My reputation was built on being someone I'm not, Thomas replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'd rather be honest and disapproved of than false and respected. He turned to the crowd again. Miss Rossi has shown me that there's more to life than safety and convention. She's taught me that sometimes the greatest risk is not taking any risks at all. The town's reaction. The crowd began to disperse, but slowly, in small groups talking among themselves. Some were clearly disapproving. Mrs. Whitman gathered her supporters and left with audible huffs of displeasure. But others lingered, and Thomas was surprised to see Mayor Harrison approach. Well, Thomas, the mayor said thoughtfully, that was quite a speech, quite a gesture. I suppose you'll want my resignation from the town council. Why would I want that? A man who's brave enough to follow his heart in front of the whole town is exactly the kind of man I want making decisions for our community. The mayor's eyes twinkled. Besides, this is the most interesting thing that's happened in Millbrook since the railroad came through. The personal moment. As the crowd finally thinned, Thomas and Isabella found themselves alone in the performance ring. The torches cast dancing shadows around them, and the night air was sweet with the scent of hay and distant rain. What happens now? Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Thomas admitted. I've never been in uncharted territory before. The circus leaves tomorrow. We have contracts, commitments. I know. But I also know, Isabella continued, stepping closer, that I've never met anyone who made me want to build something permanent. Someone who made the idea of staying in one place feel like freedom instead of prison. Thomas smiled, the first truly unguarded smile of his adult life. And I've never met anyone who made me want to learn how to fly. The resolution. 6 months later, Millbrook had a new attraction. The town's first permanent circus school, run by Isabella Rossi Whitmore and funded by the most unconventional banker in the territory. Thomas had discovered that love had made him not more reckless, but more creative, finding ways to blend stability with adventure, tradition with innovation. The school attracted young people from across the region, and slowly the town began to change. More travelers stopped to visit. New businesses opened to serve the visitors. The community that had once been defined by its resistance to change became known for embracing the unexpected. The final scene. On a warm evening in May, as Thomas walked home from the bank, he could hear laughter and music from the practice fields behind their house. Isabella was teaching a group of local children basic acrobatics, her joy in sharing her gift evident in every movement. As he watched his wife, still miraculous to him that word, spin through the air with a 7-year-old who trusted her completely, Thomas marveled at how different his life had become. He had traded certainty for possibility, reputation for authenticity, and solitude for a love that challenged him to be more than he had ever imagined. That night, as they sat on their porch watching the stars, Isabella curled against his side. Thomas reflected on the kiss that had changed everything. "Do you ever regret it?" Isabella asked, as if reading his thoughts. That night, the kiss, all of it? Thomas considered the question seriously. He had lost some friendships, certainly. Mrs. Whitman still crossed the street to avoid speaking to him directly. The bank's business had shifted somewhat, with some clients taking their accounts elsewhere, while others had come specifically because they admired his courage. But he had gained so much more. A wife who challenged him daily to see the world differently, a community that was growing more vibrant and accepting, and most importantly, the knowledge that he was living his own life instead of the life others expected him to live. "Never," he said, kissing the top of her head. "Not for a single moment." Epilogue. Years later, visitors to Millbrook would often remark on the unusual energy of the town. There was something in the air, a sense of possibility, of acceptance for those who dared to be different. And if they asked about the history of the place, long-time residents would inevitably tell them about the night the banker kissed the trapeze artist, and how a single moment of courage had transformed not just two lives, but an entire community. The story became legend, passed down through generations as proof that love, when genuine and brave enough, could indeed move mountains, or at least change the heart of a small western town forever.